Okay, so we're on to chapter 9 now of the Odyssey. We've got Molly Holly here today listening as well. Poseidon's Revenge. Zeus' messenger was an unwelcome visitor to Calypso. She wept, she stormed, she pleaded, but at last she had to submit and let Odysseus go. She allowed her trees to be felled and bound together into a raft, and she even wove a sail to hang from its mast. But all the time she coaxed and wheedled. "Don't you love me just a little? What don't you like about me? I'll change. You could love me if only you would make the effort. I'd make you immortal. Don't you want to be immortal? Do you want to die one day and go down into the underworld forever? Do you want to go out there and face Poseidon? He'll remember you. He'll never forgive you." "Madam, I am very grateful to you for saving my life," said Odysseus, straining to push his raft into the water. "I shall certainly remember you for the rest of my life." "Will you? Oh, will you really?" She stood on tiptoe in the shallows and peeked over her eyes and waved him goodbye until his sail was no more than a white speck on the horizon. "He would have loved me if only he'd stayed another few weeks," she said to herself. Then her attention was caught by a fork of lightning which stabbed the northern ocean. A fork? It was a trident, the golden trident Poseidon brandishes to quell the rebellious sea beasts and tame the shark. Out of the east came a herd of seahorses, arching their foaming white manes and trampling the sea into a dented and buckled grey. Wrecked galleys and fishing boats, which had lain empty and broken on the sea floor, were scooped up now and hurled across the water. By the light of lightning bolts which rained down around him, Odysseus saw the frightened, colourless eyes of fishes and the suckered arms of reaching squid. The waves that folded over him were shot through with eels and peppered with sharp barnacles and razor shells. The troughs that swallowed him were deeper and darker than Charybdis, and the currents beneath dragged him 3 times round the ocean like dead Hector was dragged 3 times round the walls of Troy. Then the barbs of Poseidon's trident set the ropes alight which bound together Odysseus' raft. The logs floated apart, smouldering, and Odysseus was thrown into the gnashing sea and swallowed, body and soul. He shed his sandals and heavy skirt and warrior's sword. They dropped away beneath him into the bottomless dark. He held his breath until he felt something wind round his chest that he took for an octopus. And only then did he despair and breathe in deeply and fill his lungs with water so as to be quicker drowned. The water tasted like air, like sweet, fresh air, and no sea monster had hold of him. Something pale and smooth brushed against him, but it was only a girl with a fish's tail and long strands of seaweed hair. Her scarf was round his chest, and she towed him playfully by its ends, her cheek pressed close to him. When they broke surface, the lightning illuminated a fearful reef on which the storm waves were dashing themselves into glittering clouds of spray. Odysseus, too, seemed bound to be broken against the razory rocks, and yet the girl continued to wriggle and giggle and tow him about in the loop of her magical scarf. The night was pale with weariness, but the sun was not yet up. The land beyond the reef came gradually into view, detail by detail. A gap in the reef, a steep hill, a river estuary. Suddenly, the sea nymph's game was over, and like a child tiring of a toy, she swam off, pulling her scarf behind her. Without its magic, he was once again spluttering and floundering, half drowned by each ferocious wave. Only weary and desperate swimming brought him at last into the river. On hands and knees he crawled up the icy watercourse before pulling himself ashore and into a low tree. He was afraid of wild animals eating him from head to foot before he could even wake up. In the event, it was not a wild animal which woke him, but a troop of girls come to wash and do their washing at the river. One took off her gown, and not seeing him, accidentally draped it over his face in hanging it from the tree. He woke in panic, dreaming he was back in Calypso's cave, being smothered by woven carpets. In fighting off the gown, he fell out of the tree and into the river with a loud splash. When he spluttered to his feet, he was surrounded by young women, submerged up to their shoulders, like him, and all staring with round, startled eyes. "How dare you, sir?" said the tallest. "Were you spying on us?" Odysseus shook the water out of his ears. "Certainly not, madam. I don't mind if I never see another young woman in all my life. They only make for trouble, falling in love with me and so forth." "I can't imagine why," said one with profound scorn. "Calliope, hush! The laws of hospitality demand that we should be polite to this fellow, no matter what. Do you have a name, old man?" "Old man?" Odysseus's jaw dropped. He scrambled out of the river and picked up a mirror which belonged to one of the girls. He did not recognise the face he saw in it. It was wrinkled and chapped by the sun and the sea-water. The beard and hair were grey, the eyebrows caked with salt, and the eyes red-rimmed and bloodshot. It dawned on him, too, that he was dressed only in his shirt, and that his bony, fish-nibbled knees were knocking together. He dropped the mirror. "Ladies, how can you ever forgive me for my behaviour? How can I ever make you believe that I am Odysseus, king of Ithaca, returning from the Trojan wars?" Then all the girls but one burst out laughing. The tallest said, "If you were to turn your back while we got out of the river, we might just believe you were a gentleman." An hour later, Odysseus was riding in the back of a cart, in among the wet washing of the Princess Nausicaa and her waiting women, as they drove back up to the palace of King Alcinous on the island of Scheria. And there Odysseus presented himself, a humble, nervous, shamefaced, worn and weary man in a torn and dirty shirt. King Alcinous was a man with treasure houses and armouries, 1,000 acres of farmland, and a fleet of red-prowed ships rocking in a stone-built harbour. His household numbered 100 servants, and his temples made ceaseless sacrifice to the gods. His merchant ships, crisscrossing the oceans, carried the king's fame as far as Africa and the Pillars of Hercules. But when he saw small Odysseus, bent and ragged and covered in salt-water sores, he got up from his place at table and took him by the shoulders. "You told my daughter Nausicaa that you are Odysseus, king of Ithaca, and I see in your eyes that you spoke the truth. Sit down now and eat and drink. I shall have fresh clothes brought for you and a ship made ready and filled with a few humble gifts. When you are rested, if you can bear to tell us your adventures, we would be most privileged. Your name is famous from shore to shore of the world's central sea." Then the ragged king of Ithaca was moved to tears. He embraced Alcinous. "I will tell you everything and miss nothing out," he said, drying his eyes. "But first, tell me one thing. If you have heard of my name, do you know of my three-island kingdom? It's called Ithaca, you know, and I would dearly like to see it again." "But of course I know it, my dear friend. What is Xanthi is just over the horizon, and beyond that is Kephallonia, and beyond that Ithaca with its towering Mount Neriton. A day's rowing by my best men will bring you safe home to your lovely queen." The banquet that King Alcinous mounted that night was sung of by poets and bards in songs and ballads until in due course it echoed off the clashing rocks, rang in the sea caves of Calypso, rose up to the ears of the gods, and was swept by river ocean into the shadow of the underworld. Between courses of food and between dances of dancing girls and the playing of musicians, Odysseus told his adventures. Telling them was rather like reliving them, but he missed nothing out. How and why his friends and companions had died one by one, and where his voyages had taken him. The ladies hid their faces when he described the monsters. Grown men wept when he described the loss of 12 ships with all their crews. A whole night it took to tell the whole story, and yet the whole of it was not yet told, for still Odysseus was separated from his wife and son and three-island kingdom. So at dawn he boarded the ship which Alcinous gave him, and lay down on the foredeck on a pile of blankets and embroidered clothing which Princess Nausicaa herself laid ready. The hold was filled with copper cauldrons, chests of silver, and gifts of linen and perfumes for Penelope. Every young oarsman in the Scheirian navy wanted a place in the ship, and the crew was chosen by drawing lots. Never a word was spoken about Poseidon or his unsatisfied revenge. For 10 years Odysseus had slept no more than a bird on the wing. Now, after a night's storytelling, he slept so deep and dreamlessly that he did not wake even when the Scheirian ship beached in a gravel cove, even when the rowers carried him, foredeck, treasure and all, out of the ship, even as they heaved their red-prowed ship back into the surf and rowed away singing songs about the 10-year voyage they called the Odyssey. They were almost home. They sang in time with the beat of their oars, and the song filtered down through the water and set the green strands of Poseidon's hair swaying. The sea god, who had been sleeping, stretched out into the sea's deepest trench, roused up and listened with only half an ear. Odysseus is home again, safely home to wife and kin. We, his oarsmen, share his fame. Name us when you tell of him. His voyaging is over now, pushing through Poseidon's sea. See our crimson-painted prow ends the hero's Odyssey. Poseidon's roar set the sea boiling. His head broke through the waves, not a stone's throw from the ship, and his hands encircled it like green Charybdis. Such was the phosphorescence that shone around him, that the fast ship of Scheria and all its crew were engulfed in light. Such was the look in his eyes, scowling at them across the scarlet prow, that their hearts turned to stone with the weight of terror. Not only their hearts turned to stone, the chests which cradled them, the legs braced against the baseboards themselves, the arms which were hauling on the oars themselves. The whole ship from prow to prow was turned to stone, even the water which had buoyed it up, so that it stood on a stem of rock, a black islet flaking red paint into the sea. In future years, sailors passing it would offer up devout prayers and sacrifice to Poseidon, but murmur under their breath, "Hail to the brave men of Scheria and to King Alcinous, whose kindness is commemorated forever by this sad black rock."